Well, hello everybody. This is Pastor Brad, and thank you for joining us for our Wednesday night study. Things may feel a little different or seem a little different, and it's because normally this would have been taped live last Wednesday night and air this Wednesday night, but we had technical difficulties. The audio didn't come through, so I'm actually re-recording this on a different day here in the sanctuary all by myself. So just so you know, just to be up front in case it seems kind of strange, but thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of our Wednesday night studies. Tonight, we're going to finish out with one last What Your Pastor Wishes You Knew, and then give a few closing thoughts. And as I've shared before, thank you for letting me do this and giving me the liberty to do this. Well, as we end this study, which I did way back 5 years ago and have updated for today, I'd like to remind you of 2 points that I made when we started. The first one is this: I am not sharing this study because our church has a problem and I'm trying to fix it. No, not by a long shot. If anything, our church, Pleasant View First Baptist Church, is an example of how a church is supposed to treat their pastor and his family. And so thank you so much for that. And number 2, I'm not sharing this to drum up pity for pastors. I am fully aware, as I've said before, that most, if not all, jobs come with their own set of heavy burdens. Hardship comes with the territory when it comes to being a pastor. That's just the way it is, without a doubt. It's the nature of the calling. But it doesn't hurt for you to kind of understand what we go through or what we struggle with, to kind of walk in our shoes, as that old Indian proverb says. Here's what we've looked at so far. Your pastor wishes you knew how much he needed your prayers. That was our first one. And man, do we need your prayers. I need your prayers. And I can tell that you pray for me, and I appreciate that. We also looked at how your pastor wishes you knew there is no way he can handle all the expectations of ministry on his own. That was the night I used Pastor Noah and the balloons to demonstrate all the different things we have to juggle and how there's just no way we can do it. And we talked about how the burden of ministry is meant to be shared among the congregation. We're all meant to be ministers. We also looked at how your pastor wishes you knew how hard the struggle between what God calls him to do and what members want him to do is when it comes to visiting. That's probably the toughest, if not certainly one of the toughest responsibilities that a pastor deals with. The expectations that some people have regarding his ability to make visits is just more than one person could do. Thank you for how you have been so kind to me in regards to that. And we learned that night that the most important thing, according to God's Word, according to the Lord, that a pastor does is minister the Word, preach the Word, and disciple people. We also looked at how your pastor wishes you knew he and his family, wishes you knew that he and his family struggles to live up to the unrealistic expectations as much as all the others. He wishes you knew he was just a regular guy with the added burden of a high calling. That was last week, and I began that study by reading that incredibly difficult job description that one church had for the future pastor that was to come and fill their pulpit. It was a church in Georgia. And there's just no way we can live up to that. And thank you for letting me be open and honest and share that with you. Well, now this last one that I'm going to share tonight may be the hardest one for me. And I'm pretty sure all pastors struggle with it because it has to do with something nobody wants to talk about when it comes to the pastor, and it's this. Finances. Man, nobody wants to talk about that when it comes to the pastor. For reasons I've never quite understood, lots of folks have an issue with the pastor being paid. It's almost as if they're offended if he makes a decent living. Some think the Bible teaches they're supposed to be poor and humble. Others think if the church doesn't provide what they need to live because they're in ministry, God will magically make that money appear, even if the church doesn't give them enough to buy what they need. A pastor friend many years ago told me about how he was in a finance committee meeting when his salary came up. That church had exploded in growth, both in people and finances, but his salary had not grown with it. Been many years since it had been touched. One guy spoke up when a substantial raise was recommended, saying, "Well, if we pay the pastor that, he'll make as much as my son does," as if there was something wrong with that. That's what a lot of people think when it comes to a pastor's salary. There's a verse in the pastoral epistles, remember those are the letters written by Paul to pastors, that speaks directly to this. It's one we've already looked at, and one that I told you we'd come back to. And it's 1 Timothy 5, 17 through 18. Remember, this is Paul writing to Pastor Timothy. And you would expect to find things related to pastors and what they do and such in letters written to pastors. 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18. Says, Paul writes, "Let the elders or pastors who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the Scripture says, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages.'" Now, when we looked at this verse the first time, we looked at it from the perspective of what duties a pastor performs that calls for this double honor. It's preaching and teaching above all else, even more than visitation. You remember that. But now, as we come back to it, we discover here that honor is not respect or esteem as we might hope it would be. It means specifically compensation. And all you have to do is read verse 18 to see this is true. Paul quotes a text, and he says this, "The laborer deserves his wages." Now, Paul presents a parallel thought in his defense against those criticizing him as he wrote to the church at Corinth. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 3. Listen to this. He says, "This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain.'" There that is again. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing the crop. And this is where he gets down to the nitty-gritty. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things among you? In other words, he's saying, if we as apostles and pastors and ministers that have this calling to serve you with our spiritual gifts, if we do serve those among you, is it too much for us to ask for support from you in return? N.T. Wright, whom I quote often, writes this on our 1 Timothy text. This is what he writes about our 1 Timothy text, verse 17 and 18 that we looked at. He says, "Verses 17 and 18 declare to a Christian community that was composed most likely of poor people that elders who give good leadership or who work hard at preaching and teaching should be paid double." Some translations say double honor, but the word most naturally refers in this passage to money, not social respect. And the command is backed up with two quotations. One about oxen not being muzzled while they're working hard, and one, which looks like a biblical quotation but is actually a reference to Jesus' own teaching about workers deserving their pay. Once again, this part of the letter is quite close to 1 Corinthians, in this case 9, 3 through 11, which we just read. Double pay for good leaders and teachers. That's not something you hear too often in parishes and church committees, and I can imagine enormous resentment if anyone tried to put it into practice, he writes. Yet, Wright says, there is an important principle at stake here. The churches in much of the Western world, and by churches I basically mean the non-ordained people who form the great majority of members and give the great majority of such money as there is, have allowed themselves over the years to slide by insisting that, of course, the clergy shouldn't earn as much as other people, without noticing that now most clergy spouses, in Britain at least, because he's in Britain, find themselves forced to work to help the family budget. That clergy have fallen not only way behind people with similar professional qualifications, but also behind those with no qualifications at all, and that though, thank God, there are still plenty of people willing to make the enormous sacrifice to give up a lucrative career elsewhere in order to preach the gospel and look after God's people, there must be many others who, with major family commitments, simply cannot afford to go into the ministry. There are serious questions here for churches to address in the next generation, not least how to talk about money without sounding as if they simply want to get rich themselves. It's a lot of insight there. It's a lot to take in. Paul wasn't ashamed to call for pastors being paid fairly, and yet in the church today, it's almost seen as sinful for a pastor to even bring this subject up, as if all he cares about is money. No, he cares about paying the mortgage for his daughter's braces and whatnot. It's just like everybody else. What your pastor wishes you knew is that the cost of living isn't any less for him than anyone else, and that it's both practical and biblical for him to expect to be supported by the church financially. And yet, how incredibly awkward the whole money thing is, especially since he's being supported by the generosity of the congregation. And what a blessing that is. One reason a pastor's compensation is so awkward is that, unlike everybody else in the church, what he makes isn't just displayed every month in the finance report for the world to see. It's actually discussed and voted on in committee meetings and even church business meetings. You know, I would never ever do this, but I have teasingly called for publishing members' tithes along with the pastor's finances every month, just to even the playing field. But I would never do that. I promise I never would. And by the way, just so you know, pastors hate it when this happens, and if I had $1 for every time this happened over the last couple of years, I could probably retire. But pastors hate it when this happens. Inevitably, at some point, they're going to be in a finance meeting or some committee meeting or something, and a budget shortfall is going to be discussed. And somebody will jokingly say, "Well, why don't we just take it out of the pastor's salary?" And you know, if you've done that, I love you, and it's okay. And I certainly love and forgive over the years those who have done that. But man, we hate it when that happens. Do you remember that guy I told you about who was always joking about me working only a couple of hours a week, and how one day I got tired of it and I put my arm around him and told him, "Okay, yeah, it is neat. Why don't we get on our knees and ask God to call you into the ministry?" And he never bothered me again. Well, guess what? That same guy had issues with what I got paid as well. He would say all the time, as we would exit the church one day, and we had small children at the time, he would say, "Man, do you keep all that money you make in that diaper bag? Must be nice to get paid that kind of money," because he got to see what he thought I made. I'll talk about that in a minute. What he thought I made every month on the finance report. Well, finally one day I had all I could take. I'd got him to stop talking about how I worked, and I had to get this taken care of as well. So I said, man, it's not big enough to carry all the money I make. And he kind of sulled up a bit, and he never said it again. So I don't feel bad about that at all, if you just want to know the truth. Now, the reason that he thought I made a lot of money is, like most folks, he didn't understand that the budget line item for a pastor almost always reflects his package and not his pay. His package and not his pay. There's so much confusion over this. There's a difference between what you see in the budget that makes up his package and then what he's actually paid. And this right here, I call this pay column. This is what he can buy bread with. There's a difference between the two. This is part of this, but this is different than that. Now, some time ago, my wife worked with a lady who knew I was a pastor, so she always talked about her pastor with my wife. And this was a subject that came up often. She could not get over how much they paid their pastor. Well, my goodness, when you looked at the finance report every month, their pastor made $75,000. My goodness, she would say, that's too much money for a pastor to make. My husband doesn't even make that much money. Now, what she didn't understand was that out of this package figure, and that's what that was, that $75 was the package, not his pay. What she didn't understand was that about $15,000 to $20,000 of that had to be used to buy health insurance and dental insurance and such for his family. And that may be just a little bit low there. He had to use that $75,000 to buy that for his family. She also didn't realize that from that figure, he also had to take out mileage expenses, because when he went to the hospital and such, he would have to pay for gas. He would have to pay for maintenance on his car. From that $75,000, he would also have to pay for books and things that he would need to help prepare sermons, conferences that he went to, things like that. I mean, there's so many things that he has to pay for. For instance, taking church members out to lunch for meetings and such like that. That would have to come out. It's called pastor's ministry expense. Comes out of that $75,000. You know what another thing that comes out of this? His retirement. One day that pastor is going to want to retire. And so every month he'll have to take some of that, and it's quite a big figure, by the way, and he would have to take some of that and put it into some type of annuity or something so that he could retire one day. And not only that, and here's something what a lot of people don't know. I don't know why, but for the IRS purposes, a pastor is both employed and self-employed at the same time. And this $75,000, most pastors have to pay the full 15% Social Security tax on that. If you have just a regular job and you're not self-employed, you only pay half and your employer pays half. But that's not so for a pastor. He pays more than you do because he has to pay the full 15% amount. That has to come out of that $75,000, and that's quite a bit too. And not only that, he takes his tithe out of that as well. So when you kind of run the math on that, and I'm just guesstimating here, and you subtract all this out, and I'm probably being a little too kind, it's probably lower than this, but what his pay ends up being is more in the $40,000 range, not the $75,000 range. And you can say, well, what does it matter? Well, the thing about it is, imagine if you took a job with some company and they told you, well, your pay is $75,000. But when you got there, your checks every week only equaled up to $40,000 a year. And you said, well, that's not fair. You told me you were going to pay me $75,000. And they said, yeah, but you're not realizing we're paying for your insurance. We're paying for you annuity and such that we're putting in there. All these other things. You don't have it listed as part of your pay when you take a job. So there's a difference between your package and your pay, and that's why most people don't understand. Kind of puts things in perspective, I hope, for you. Now, one last thought on this, and I'm ending my talk on finances with this. And this is something that I've learned over the years, and it's super important, and I hope everybody listening will take to heart. You know, if the pastor has to constantly worry about how he's going to take care of his family financially because the church is underpaying him or expecting him to live off something that he can't live off of, he'll never be able to take care of his flock spiritually. And so it's important for the church to recognize these things and do what they can. And I want to tell you something, church. This is one thing I've never had to worry about. As with all these other things, you have been just a tremendous example of how a church should take care of their pastor financially. You guys have been so good to us. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate that. You have never made it awkward for me. You've never made me feel bad for the fact that I take a salary, and I appreciate that so much. So thank you for that. And so I'm done with that. You can do what you want with it. But I do want to leave with you a few things, kind of sundry things, various and sundry things that you can do to really love and support your pastor as I close out what your pastor wishes you knew. And then the first one is this. Let your pastor and his family just be themselves. Now, I got burned on this early on. I didn't know any better early on in ministry than just to be myself around church folks. And we went to this church, and it wasn't long until this young couple wanted to bring dinner over to our home, and so they did, and we were excited. They were about our age. We didn't have any friends in this church, and we were aching for friendship and companionship, and we were so thankful for them to come, and we had a great time with them. We cut up and just had a lot of fun. In fact, we got along so well, we put down our guard a bit, and in retrospect, I realized the husband asked a lot of questions of me, and I answered them honestly, just being open and honest. And at the time, I thought he was just making friendly conversation. I remember one of the things he asked me, "Man, what would you do if you ever won the lottery?" And I dreamed big and told him what I would do if I won the lottery. Well, later, I learned that what he was really doing that night was fishing for ammunition to use against me. Wasn't long after that till somebody said, "Yeah, he's telling everybody that all you care about is money because there's all these things that you want to get and you want to do." And many other things we had shared just out of being with him that night, he used to slam me among other people. Man, I want to tell you something. That hurt so bad. And it made me want to never open myself up again to having friendships in the church. Now here's the thing, folks. You should certainly expect your pastor to be a spiritual, godly man, an example to the congregation, but you also have to allow him and his whole family to just be human. You also shouldn't expect more from his wife and children, and especially his children, than they are able to give. You know, I've lost count over the years how many times a pastor search committee turned to my wife and asked, "Now, can you play the piano?" They wanted to get kind of 2 for 1 in the package. They wanted to have somebody to play the piano but not pay them anything. Or they wanted somebody to lead the women's ministry but not have to pay them anything. They wanted somebody to lead the nursery but not have to pay them anything. They wanted somebody to lead Vacation Bible School but not have to pay them anything. And I had to figure out over time a way to protect my wife from that, because that was unhealthy for her to have those expectations put on her. And so I had to come to a place where in those search committee meetings I would say, "Hey, you know what? My wife is part of my ministry, but she will decide for herself what she feels led to do based on her own gifts and callings. And so you know what? Just she's off base there. You can't touch her in those regards. You just let her be herself, and she'll decide what she wants to do, not what she's expected to do just because she's the pastor's wife." Kids, though, man, my kids over the years have had so many times something like this happen. They would be scolded by church folks for doing what every other kid did, and that's just act like kids. And they were told numerous times, "Well, you're the pastor's child. Well, I expected more from you." Or, "I can't believe that you don't know that Bible verse." "Well, you're the pastor's child. You should have that Bible verse remembered." "I can't believe you didn't go to church that night." "I can't believe you this, that, or other because you're the pastor's kid." And I'm going to tell you something. Man, I messed up so badly in this regard. I made this terrible mistake of raising my kids according to what they expected that I should do, rather than focusing on my child and raising them according to their own bent, the way God put them together. And I'm still paying for that terrible mistake today. They have shared with me often, as now they're all grown, how crushing the weight of that expectation of them was. Listen, it's no accident that there's a kind of a running joke, but it's not a joke, of how wild pastors' children are. It's true, and it's because I believe they just feel that crushing weight of those expectations that they cannot live up to, so they just give up and then rebel. Of course, I personally believe the reason that the pastor's kids are usually so wild is because they hang around the deacon's kids a little too much. But that's just my own personal thought about that. But I had to learn to let my children just be who they are and give them the liberty to make mistakes and just become who God has called them to be. The children are a part of a pastor's ministry as well, but they are not expected to be the shining examples of what the perfect child is to look like. They can't carry that burden. An adult can't carry that burden, let alone a child. Give your pastor the liberty to have varying relationships with others in the church, just like everyone else. And then the pastor will be closer to some than others. Even Jesus had some disciples that he was closer to than others. And thank you, church, for loving us and our family like that. You have let us be ourselves. You don't have a choice because that's just who we are. And you've let my daughters just be themselves, and you have just loved them despite the fact that often they have not lived up to that image that people expect them to. Thank you for that. Now, I mentioned this early on in this study, but I'll mention it again. Encourage your pastor to keep healthy. Encourage him to keep healthy physically. For years, I stood behind the pulpit or sat behind a desk and did little else. And I watched my waistline go from a wonderful 32 inches to 40 inches, and my weight from about 160 pounds to 235 pounds over 16 years. There was no way I could squeeze exercise into a busy schedule. And I'll just be honest with you. I felt like if the church saw me out running or biking or working out, they would feel like I wasn't using my time wisely because I wasn't, preparing a sermon or sharing the gospel or something like that. It took a life crisis and a struggle with severe depression to change my ways. And I finally began to get fit. I coped with that by working out and losing weight. And I still try to do that even today. If I had known then what I know now about how much staying fit would benefit me, I would have hit the gym a long time ago. I am not ashamed to tell you that when I'm out biking regularly, when I'm out running regularly, when I'm out getting exercise, I consider that a ministry investment as much as if I was sitting at that desk preparing a sermon or going to a conference to learn how to be a better pastor. It keeps me sharp, it gives me energy, and it helps curb the depression that all pastors deal with because of the struggles of ministry. Which brings up another kind of health the church must consider with the pastor. You really need to support him and encourage him to stay fit mentally. The depression rate among pastors is rising, and the suicide rate is rising as well. Not too long ago, a prominent Baptist pastor took his life after years of battling it, and in just the last couple of months, I've lost count of how many pastors have done the same. Pastors are particularly susceptible to depression because they create a life for themselves that is so strongly intertwined, and I'm quoting someone here, they create a life for themselves that is so strongly intertwined with their ministry that their emotional health is dependent on the state of their ministry. And that's so true. Unlike a lot of jobs, a pastor's very identity is tied up in his ministry. If he preaches a bad sermon, he's a bad pastor. He feels like one. If he missed something, if he led poorly, if he failed in some way in ministry, it's just a personal feeling for him. It's really difficult to be a pastor in that regard. So one of the big ways that you help keep your pastor fit mentally is to provide adequate time for him to be away. Don't give him an option of whether or not he's going to take his vacations. You require him to. I tell you what, it doesn't impress me one bit when a pastor or even a church brags about how their pastor never takes vacations. That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard in my life. Those are the pastors that end up falling. Those are the pastors that end up leaving the ministry is because they burn themselves out. And the church just let them do that. Thank you, church, for when I came on here that you gave me plenty of time of vacation. And you did something that hardly any church I've ever heard of does. You base my vacation pay on not how long I've been with you, but how long I've been in the ministry. Listen, pastors are called by and employed by the God of all creation. And when they go to another church, they've not changed jobs, they've changed locations. And churches should recognize that and base their time off on how many years they've been in ministry, not how long they've been with that church. And you've done that, church, and I thank you for that. Encourage them to go to conferences and encourage them for something that's not even heard of in Baptist churches, and that's a sabbatical, where every 5 or 7 years or so you give them a month or 2 or 3 away to go to a spiritual retreat or write a book or just seek God in some way. Well, enough of that. Finally, and maybe above all, if you want to help your pastor, you need to support him unless you have no other choice. And here's a little something that might help you do that. I've used this for years to help me, and I think you might find it as helpful as well. You need to support your pastor at all costs unless he does something obviously and completely unbiblical. I hope I don't misspell any of these. unless he does something completely unbiblical. Now, the way I gauge all these things I'm going to share with you is this. If what I'm going to stop supporting him over is something that would pretty much be the same response in any church, anywhere, or any denomination, then I'm probably on the right track. But if it's something that another church might not have a problem with, then it may be more my personal preference or my particular theological bent than it is he's done something actually wrong. So you support your pastor unless he does something obviously and completely unbiblical. You also support your pastor unless he does something completely unethical. Unethical. It's so obviously something unethical that pretty much any church, everyone would agree, that's wrong. Also, support him unless he does something completely unreasonable. Now let me explain what I mean by that, because that's a very subjective thing. You might find it unreasonable, but somebody else might not. Here's an example of this. Let's just say a pastor goes to a church out in the middle of nowhere of 30 people, and there's only 1,000 people in the town they live in, and he wants to lead the church to build a $10 million sanctuary. That's not just faith, that's foolishness. That's completely unreasonable. I couldn't support that guy in that. But it's only the big things like that that just obviously are completely unreasonable. You also support your pastor unless he does something immoral. If a pastor has a moral failure, if he is unfaithful to his wife, something like that, yeah. You know what? You can show him grace and love him, help him be restored, but you can't support that in a pastor. And then finally, you support him unless he's done something obviously illegal. I know one church that my grandparents attended, the pastor wanted them to what we call cook the books, where it looked like he made less than what he did so that he didn't have to pay so much in taxes. Folks, that's unethical and illegal, and that's just wrong. You can't support a pastor in that. But listen, if you can't obviously and completely put what he's doing in one of these categories, what that probably means is the problem you have is personal. And you can't stop supporting a pastor just for that. So, there you go. That's all I got. I'm done tonight. Thank you so much, church, for letting me share this. I've loved sharing these things with you. As I said, you guys have got this down. You know what you're doing. You do a great job. Maybe if you're part of another church, you might want to think about and pray about some of the things that I've shared over this series, what your pastor wishes you knew. So, one last thing is an advertisement for what's happening next week. And remember, the broadcasts are a week behind on-campus studies. I am going to do something I've wanted to do, but it's kind of daunting and I've been afraid to do, but I am going to start this next Wednesday night taking us through the book The Unseen Realm by Dr. Michael Heiser. We saw that movie a couple of months ago and a lot of people were really impacted by it. Dr. Michael Heiser is not sharing anything new about what happens with spiritual warfare and such in the unseen realm. It's actually very ancient. In fact, it's the way that the people of Jesus' day would have viewed this, but somewhere along the way we got off track. And when you go back to that view and when you understand what really is happening behind the scenes, you get a grasp of Scripture that you don't have before, and it opens up a lot of things. So I'm excited to share that book with you. God bless you all. I hope you have a great night.